Family history is a somewhat intriguing subject, and it seems it is of more interest to the generations following by perhaps 5 to 10 decades. The history of Alfred Edmund Brace has never been documented as a whole, and perhaps never can be. Memories fade, documents are lost, photos are damaged, and impressions differ. In the following presentation, I hope to at least illustrate the life of a very highly respected and talented man, my maternal grandfather, Alfred Edmund Brace. Hi, this is Shane Davis. Welcome to my Magic Lantern slideshow. This slideshow features many highlights of my grandfather's life. My grandfather was many things, but most of all, he was an artist. He painted in oils and watercolors. Through the years, I have collected many of his possessions and artifacts, things which were dear to him and also things which are dear to me. Although Grandpa died over 65 years ago, my memories of him are still very vivid. Through the slideshow, I shall share many of these memories with you. And keeping that in mind, let the show begin. It is fitting to show family photos and documents with this lantern, as it has its own history. This particular lantern was utilized by a traveler who showed his thousands of slides Canada-wide. My father subsequently obtained both the lantern and the slides. Grandpa would have seen some of the slides in the late 40s. In this copy of his birth certificate, we see that Grandpa's father was a cow keeper. So we know that Grandpa's early life was on a farm. The farm was located just north of London, and in 1868, that area was still agricultural. My, how times have changed. Photos of Grandpa are very scarce. These 3 photos are the earliest I have. In the latter photo, he is wearing glasses. From a very early age, Grandpa sketched and painted. In many of his art books, etc., he sketched everything from the human form to sailboats. He would walk from the farm into the National Gallery in London and would make sketches or paint scenes from the masterpieces hanging in the gallery. My mother, Rometty Davis, recalled the following details of her father. I quote, "He told me that this was his practice to go to the National Gallery and copy some of the works of the great masters. One day he had set up his easel, got out his paints, and worked for some time on a copy of one of the great paintings. He soon attracted a good many people who stood round admiring his work with oohs and ahs. He felt like a young genius being in the midst of such admiration. His father would suddenly show up at such a moment and say, 'Come on, Bill, it's time to milk the cows.' He was totally deflated." End of quote. As with most artists, Grandpa would sketch his ideas on paper. He certainly sketched the human form, as well as clouds and sailboats. Of course, he studied color, and he made notes on how to mix his oil paints for consistent colors while the oils on his canvas dried. At the age of 18, he made this maul stick to assist him in his painting. He was determined, and he was serious. In her recollections, my mother wrote, "He had always been very interested in art and studied at the Royal Academy when he was a young man. His father, owning a dairy and a butcher shop in London at 133 Wells Street, Hackney, naturally expected him to be in the shop. It was not long before he was old enough to be of help. However, his favorite spot was up in the hayloft of the cowshed, where after climbing a little ladder and pushing through a small square, he found a good place to paint undisturbed. There was a small skylight and a space among the hay for his easel, and here he painted a good many of his early works. He became a member of the Society of Science, Letters, and Art. He soon achieved great recognition and won a bronze medal, and a year later it was followed by a silver medal. In November of 1886, he wrote the following: City of London College, White Street, Moorsfield, Associated Kensington Art Department S. In the large hall, a great meeting of students of the college assembled to receive various diplomas, medals, prizes of studentship. His Grace the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Davidson, was supported by representatives of the City of Guilds and Mayor of London, etc. The Archbishop, after hearing several interesting speeches in favor of students' progress, then arose to tumultuous reception. He was assisted by the guilds, gentlemen, city guilds, as needed. Then, with his leonine head bowed graciously to all present and the student's name called, he made a kindly speech to the party and placed his hands in blessing on each student's head. And so it went on interminably. Such a personality he was indeed, which was ended in a grand crescendo to the end of the meeting. Really a grand time to remember in after years and speaking impersonally. Memo A.E. Brace. During his time in the Academy, he met with many prominent artists. One such artist was W.A.R. Grieve. Grieve gave Grampa this allegorical painting through their friendship. It was a trend in that era to sign paintings with a monogrammed first letter of the artist's name. This letter would contain the initials of the artist plus each letter in the name. It was from W.A.R. Grieve that Grampa developed his monogram signature with A.E. Brace. Obviously, Andrew Grieve appreciated Grampa's abilities. He also gave this unsigned landscape watercolor by J.M.W. Turner to Grampa. Turner was prolific and painted many thousands of watercolors, not all of which he signed. Among Grampa's possessions, which I have, is this painting by Yeend King. It is dated on the back at 1892. The girl in a classical courtyard feeding the birds is a typical scene painted by Yeend King. From behind, the frame of the painting is obviously very old, with the corner pegs to keep the canvas taut. On the back of the frame is King's autograph and date of 1892. I feel very fortunate in being the custodian of one of my grandfather's most treasured possessions. The American artist James McNeill Whistler lived in London in the 1890s, and it is there where he met Grampa. It was during this time that he said of Grampa's paintings that, if he stuck to painting skies, trees, and water, he could become a famous artist. Typically, Grampa's paintings contain these elements, possibly a direct influence of Whistler's comments. It was the custom in the late 1800s to go to the National Gallery in London and copy the paintings of the masters. Grampa did a copy of Constable's Haywain, which did not survive. But Grampa kept this postcard and painted a copy in the 1940s. Another postcard from Grampa's possession is this scene from Cockington Village. The various elements, such as the cottages and trees, were depicted in his later works. And now for a bit of family history. In the late 1890s, Grandpa met his wife-to-be, Florence Patience Remmett. Florence was the daughter of George Remmett. George was a furniture dealer in London. My mother referred to him as an antique dealer. Today, we must be the judge. However, from his store came these Amari plates, which are now considered antiques. The wicker handles became very worn. I remember my father removing them in the 1940s, and they sat in the entry hall for many, many years. It was in the late 1890s that Grandpa and Grandma were married. Their firstborn was my Uncle Don. In November of 1904, my dear mother was born. Both my mother's and my father's families moved to Vancouver from England. Mum studied art and music and became an accomplished pianist. It was in the early 1930s when she met my father, Reginald Stanley Davis. They were married soon after. A family of 4 children arrived, and we lived in North Vancouver on 126 East 12th Street. As a wedding present, Grandpa painted Storm at Sea, which hangs over the fireplace. Now living in Vancouver, Grandpa continued to paint, especially in oils. These 3 paintings are from the very early 1920s. They are painted on 1/8-inch 3-ply plywood. After nearly 100 years, they show some signs of warping. Grandpa was not a wealthy man, so he could not afford to buy proper canvases. So he painted on whatever he could obtain. He also sketched whenever he found space. He often repainted over existing paintings. Thus, we have lost those earlier works forever. My father came to Grandpa's rescue. In 1940, Dad built Grandma and Grandpa a house on West 23rd Street in Vancouver. Grandpa set up his painting studio at the back of the house, where he painted quite prolifically in both oils and watercolors. He was happy. Those of us who remember Grandma and Grandpa's home recall its pleasant living room, the brown velour Chesterfield and armchair, the radio phonograph in the corner, Grandpa's paintings on the walls, plus the pale green glass figurine standing in the center of the flower bowl display. Dad promoted Grandpa's paintings. He and Mum took a series of paintings to Los Angeles in late 1946. They were on display for the month of December at the Francis Webb Galleries. As far as I remember, a few were sold. The paintings on display were both in oils or watercolors. The scenes were of England and British Columbia. The skies from BC and the waves from our rugged coast are very dramatic, to say the least. Upon returning to Vancouver, another exhibition of Grandpa's works was organized at David Spencer Limited in Vancouver. With articles and photographs in the province newspaper, the display was a success. In my mother's notes, she wrote, and I quote, 90 pictures were displayed in Spencer's with Mayor Malkin and Chris Spencer conducting the opening ceremonies. Students from several art schools were conducted through the display, and altogether they were viewed by about 15,000 people during the week they were on display. As with the exhibition in Los Angeles, the subject matter here in Vancouver was from Britain and from BC, also oils and watercolors. My father realized that Grandpa loved to paint in oils, but did not have the time or money to provide enough framed canvases to satisfy his creative urges. Therefore, Dad set up a workshop in our home. He bought canvas and made frames. Each week he would assemble canvases of many sizes. On Saturday afternoon, our family of 6 plus canvases would drive to Grandpa's home. Dad would give these canvases plus fresh tubes of oils to Grandpa. He would also pay Grandpa for his work. The same process occurred with the watercolors. Through the years, Dad acquired several hundred oil paintings and watercolors. Some paintings were sold, but his children now each have collections of Grandpa's paintings. Much of the subject matter in Grandpa's paintings reflects his early past of the rural landscape north of London and beyond. His images are strong, his colors are very sure, and the moods he creates are timeless. Of all the oils which Grandpa painted, my favorite is this one entitled Sunrise. It is subtitled Sunset. It has a hidden inner glow which for me is totally entrancing. Here is a relatively small canvas which Grandpa painted in early 1946. It was considered very daring by all who saw it. The reason is that Grandpa intended for it to be hung in all different ways. He was not stuffy, he was playful. Grandpa was much more prolific in watercolors than oils, possibly because oils took too long to dry in those days. Again, his colors were very strong and very sure. And again, his subject matter was mostly of England and Western Canada. Perhaps the influence of J. Thors, R.A., with whom he studied for 2 years, influenced his style and technique. Grandpa also studied with Yeen King, who brought out an understanding of color shading that is quite remarkable. While in Britain, Grandpa took painting trips through England and Wales with such artists as Walter Keyes. Again, reading from my mother's notes, she writes, "Since Brace never commercialized his art and presented only a few paintings to near friends, the Davis collection comprises almost all the Brace canvases. As he did not paint for money, his entire thought was perfection, and this explains the complete absence of potboilers and moneymakers, each painting relying upon itself as a masterpiece and not on the artist's reputation. His over 60 years of sky painting made him probably the greatest painter of this period for cloud and cloud effects." In the late 1940s, I often stayed with Grandma and Grandpa. During these stays, I would watch him paint. I clearly remember his painting this particular study, which he entitled The Visitor. Since I was his visitor, we talked about how a visitor to a holiday location would observe all the new and exciting things which he saw. Grandpa later did a larger version of The Visitor. These black and white photos were taken for the public showings of his works and for the Christmas cards which were sent out by my parents. A note within each card stated, "A Brace painting in your home has this wonderful quality. First you discover you can live with it, and then you discover that you have no wish to live without it." Every time I see a Brace painting, it is like seeing another member of Grandpa's extended family. Each painting is bright and cheerful. Some even have a special personality, such as this delicate maritime scene. It is one of my favorites. Grandpa was short in stature, walked with a cane, but was always friendly and gentle. He always had time to be with his grandchildren. Clouds fascinated Grandpa. I remember several occasions standing with him watching the clouds move past in a high wind. He would point out their shapes, their color gradients, their brilliant linings, and their strength or softness. His paintings show this insight, both in his oils and his watercolors. In Mum's notes she wrote, and I quote, "He had trouble with his eyes. The crystalline lenses in both eyes were petrified. Dr. Farish, one of the foremost eye specialists in Vancouver at the time, said he would have to wait a year before he could operate, so during that time he was blind. The 7 operations for the removal of the lenses were the first ever to be performed in Vancouver. He regained his sight and painted much better than he had ever done. He was involved in an accident with his legs, which prohibited him from doing any manual work. Reg, my husband, commissioned him to paint steadily. So, at that last 5 years of his life, he painted some 300 to 350 paintings. In his last few years, Grandpa continued to sketch figures. He cut out frames of the comic strip Tarzan. During his life in Canada, he worked as an insurance salesman. He worked as a night watchman at Woodward's and held up P.C. Woodward, thinking he was a thief. Grandpa enjoyed poetry. Here's a clipping of a poem I found in his papers. My friend Alex Wilson will recite it for us and invoke Grandpa's memory.
Mollybone. Your mother won't hear of the match, Mollybone. She won't let me have you at all. For me cabin has never a thatch, Mollybone, and never a door in the wall. She won't let me take you for life, Mollybone, for life ain't all dance and a jig, and I haven't a place for a wife, Mollybone, let alone a cow or a pig. What does that matter at all, Mollybone? Come winter, or come the black storm, to howl through the holes in the wall, Mollybone, young love would keep us both warm. We don't want a mansion so smart, Mollybone, with carpets to cover the floor, while you have a place in me heart, Mollybone, and I have a corner in yours.
I remember Grandpa in his later years squinting at his easel. His sight was failing, but his mind was still just as keen as always. If one squints, as did Grandpa, the abstraction disappears and one is brought to reality. Here are Grandpa's last 4 paintings. In my mother's notes, she wrote, "My dad handed me 4 small watercolors saying that they were for me, and he was not going to paint any more, as he was tired. He said his work was done. He died 2 weeks later." For me, these 4 paintings highlight the last period of his life. They are impressionistic, although the realism which he has had in his imagination was tempered by his failing eyesight and slightly unsteady hand. The colors are vivid, the images are unmistakable. These paintings reflect the many experiences of his creative life. Grandpa died in December of 1949. I remember that fateful day. I remember crying, knowing that my life had changed. He was a truly amazing man and had an amazing influence on each of our lives in the family. Here are a few interesting facts relating to Grandpa. The de Brace family came to England as part of the retinue of William the Conqueror in 1066. From my research, I have discovered that the de Braces became well-to-do landowners in Worcester. They even had their own coat of arms. They eventually anglicized their surname to Brace. Grandpa's name was Alfred Edmund. So was his father's, making him a Brace Jr. Grandpa married a Remmet. The Remmets also came to England in 1066 as part of the retinue. Grandpa is listed as a dairyman on Mum's birth certificate of 1904. Memories of Grandpa do not always correspond. It was in 1912 when Grandpa's family came to Canada. Apparently they could not afford to sail on the Titanic. But they sailed the same time on perhaps the Californian. It stopped due to icebergs. Grandma remembers seeing the lights of the Titanic twinkling as it steamed past. Much controversy still surrounds the Californian. After moving to Canada in 1912, he sold life insurance. Then he was a night watchman. In his final years, he officially became an artist, and it is for that which he is best remembered. Another interesting fact about Grandpa is that he painted in many different sizes. Of his surviving paintings, the largest are about 57 inches by 34 inches. He painted at least 5 of this size. He painted a large number of watercolors which Mum called miniatures. Their size is approximately 4 inches by 6 inches. When we lived at 126, Grandpa painted a Western theme over the kitchen table. It depicted a cowboy lassoing a furious bull. I estimate the total width at about 12 to 14 feet. The details were amazing, just as were the details of his miniatures. It is through the Davis family and its relations that this history of Grandpa has been preserved. Were it not for my father and mother, the history would have been very different. I wish to thank the members of my extended family for their access to their collections and their recollections. I wish to thank my parents for their acuity in creating and preserving the artifacts which are such a tangible memory of my grandpa. Most of all, I wish to thank Grandpa for creating such a legacy for his many descendants to cherish and enjoy.